So we've been looking at the opening address of Pope Paul VI to the second session in 1963, at which he thanked Pope John, kind of prayed to Pope John, and then at which he spoke about the role of the Pope in relation to the Church. And we had this part of the mosaic of Pope Honorius, in which Pope Honorius is so small by comparison to the foot of Christ in the Basilica of St. Paul's outside the walls. So that's the opening of the second session. When the actual work began, Cardinal Ottaviani, whom we know now, the head of the Holy Office, the head of the doctrine of the faith, presented a revised draft of the document on the Church. Remember, that's the one that had been criticized so strongly by Bishop de Smet as being triumphalist, etc. A new draft had been, in the meantime, prepared in the interim between session 1 and session 2, and it was given the name Lumen Gentium. Lumen Gentium means the light of the peoples, the light of the peoples. And you might think, oh, that's the Church. No, it's not the Church, it's Christ. If you go, they all begin with the first Latin words, which you can understand why they do that. Well, that's what they've always done. Lumen Gentium, I think, yeah, Christ is the light of the nations. That's the beginning of it. All right, so Ottaviani presents this new draft. It's got a lot more references to the Bible in it, because you've had all these experts coming in and saying, what you really need here is that. People who've worked on writing about the Church for decades, and you bring them all together, they don't argue, they have a common mind, and they produce something. There is a chapter devoted to the people of God. The people of God. The people of God. Who's the people of God? It's an expression which hadn't been used before. But it's about all the people. Well, firstly, all the people in the Church. But then if you read Lumen Gentium, it will expand that definition. Are Protestants people of God? Are Muslims people of God? Are people who are searching people of God? There's ways in which they are also people of God. So it's quite an innovative and maybe controversial title for one of the chapters. And then there was a chapter about holiness. Holiness, they say. Why have you got a chapter on holiness? We never had a chapter on holiness before. But there were obviously people in the commission saying, what is the Church for? The Church is to make people holy. So let's talk about holiness and what it is to be holy. And how holiness is not going to be only my personal holiness, but my holiness in the way I live, the way I reach out. So you get into dialogue and service and all these things. And obviously in Lumen Gentium, the most fraught discussion is going to be about the place of bishops. And they define bishops as having their authority through sacramental ordination. So you have the ordination of a priest, and then you have the ordination of a bishop. So that was clarified. But how did their authority relate to that of the Pope? So, because this was such a delicate issue, it was agreed with Pope Paul that there should be votes on different issues in relation to this document. Oh, another one was the institution of the permanent diaconate. That's also in Lumen Gentium. And all these proposals were accepted. So that's a a pretty good achievement, which we can say is one of the great achievements of Session 2. Throughout the sessions of the council, and as these continued, the issue of ecumenism, so remember, the ecumenical council is about a council for the world. Ecumenism is about reaching out to different groups within Christianity. Finally, there would be a document given the name Unitatis Redintegratio, which means the re-establishment of unity. But one very important thing, this was the first of 3 rather dramatic acts of Paul VI. He's innovating. He's doing things which have never been done before. And he has received an invitation from the Patriarch of Constantinople, known as the Ecumenical Patriarch, Athenagoras, there he is, to come on pilgrimage to the Holy Land. What? The Pope's going to the Holy Land? The Pope's never been to the Holy Land before. The Pope's never been in a plane before. But he goes. And he makes this announcement at the closing session on 4th of December 1963. And the applause takes the roof off St. Peter's. There are several points at which this happens, and some of the acts of Paul VI invite such a reaction. So at the suggestion of Athenagoras, the Orthodox Patriarch, Paul went to Jerusalem and met him on the 5th of January 1964, and there they are. It was a suggestion of Athenagoras. That's very interesting. But there were already relations, there were already contacts going on. And if we look forward to what's going to happen at the rest of the council, the following 2 sessions, the mutual excommunications which were made in 1054 between the Church of the West and the Church of the East, they're going to be lifted at the end of the council. Furthermore, Athenagoras is going to come to Rome in 1967. And you don't mind me saying that I was there, that these 2 figures walking up the slope into St. Peter's Basilica, Athenagoras is obviously taller, and Paul VI, little acknowledging how important this was historically. I only found out subsequently. Oh, Athenagoras is coming to see the Pope today. How amazing. Right, so this is kind of conclusion of session 2. Right, with the event of going to the Holy Land. Let's move on. We have to move on to get towards the 3rd session. Right. And once again, it's the document on the church which is having the biggest struggle, because it's being opposed by a large number of the council fathers. Remember what Paul VI had said to his young priests. In the council, the church is asking itself what it is. That's Paul VI. I don't know what the church is. I don't know what the church is for. So if you're asking those kind of questions, you're in good company. What are we for? And once we ask the question, what are we for? And we listen to the council, we listen to the Holy Spirit. Oh, that's what we're for. We are not irrelevant to what's going on in Britain in 2025, or indeed in the world. We have issues that we need to embraced and acknowledged as being part of what the church is for. So we're moving towards autumn 1964, third session. The draft document on the church, which had had so many criticisms, remember Bishop de Smet saying how triumphalistic it was, the first draft, it's made a lot of progress. On the day before the council was due to start its third session, there was a long memo from 25 cardinals warning Paul VI that the teaching of collegiality in chapter 3 of Lumen Gentium posed a grave danger to the church. So let me just remind you. Chapter 1, the mystery of the church. Chapter 2, the people of God. Chapter 3, the hierarchical constitution of the church and the episcopate in particular. So this is the chapter which they have serious problems. Given that you've got more than 2,000 bishops at the council, the minority view actually had very few supporters. But it was always given credit. It was given huge credit, huge attention. I mean, I say this is what Pope Francis did as well. What the popes tend to do. We've got to keep people on board. So how do we bring them along as well? And sometimes we make mistakes in that regard. Okay, the minority must be respected. We can't just say, oh, you're only 50, we're 2,000 on your bikes. We can't say that. So when we get to the third session, September the 14th, Feast of the Holy Cross, 1964, Pope Paul inaugurates the third session. Remember, this is his second session. And he inaugurates it with, guess what? A concelebration. A concelebration. Priests celebrating Mass together. I remember when I first went to Rome in 67, and then suddenly, and they were all at their side altars, and then suddenly we had concelebration. We only had it on Sunday and Thursday because it was a new thing, but then we had it every day. Okay, so concelebrants from 19 countries concelebrated with the Pope. So instead of coming up vested in this cope and being, as he was in the first session, Paul comes up with a chasuble to say Mass with the other fathers. So this is a wonderful sign of welcoming the changes in liturgy. So all this sort of sign language that you get. So during this session, there are other very significant documents that we haven't got time to say much about. Two extremely significant, what they're called just declarations, but they're of immense importance. One on religious liberty, called Dignitatis Humanae. Religious liberty, say the conservatives. You can't have religious liberty. Everybody must become a Catholic. But no, this says people must make their choice of what they believe. So religious liberty was anathema, but suddenly, because it's been spoken of so much within the church in the time leading up to Vatican II, you get religious liberty, a document. And then the document on other faiths. Other faith. Remember what I said about Judaism, Muslims, etc. This becomes a document on all other faiths, which incorporates within it, it's quite a short document, in its final paragraph, some very significant statements about Jews. For example, we cannot say that Jews as a whole are responsible for the death of Christ. And the language of deicide, of saying the Jews killed God, this is completely out of the question. So it was a huge step forward in developing relations between Christians and Jews. Right. Okay. The worst week of the council is coming up quickly now. There's a famous week known as La Settimana Nera, the Black Week, which is in November 1964, at the end of the third session. Well, this is what people call it. The final vote on Lumen Gentium, on the church, is approaching. Okay, it's 1964, and Lumen Gentium has the date. We must have the date 1964 at the end of it. 21st of November 1964. So the document on the church, which is such a struggle, actually comes out in the third session. It doesn't wait till 1965. They've got it fixed. But as the final vote approached, there was the appearance of the nota explicativa previa. Something solemn, you put it in Latin. The nota explicativa previa, the preliminary note of explanation. And this note was created and sent by Paul VI to be attached to Lumen Gentium. And it says it's a preliminary note. It should go at the beginning. I think it's at the end. I think it's been put at the end. Anyway, the point is, because of the protests of a large number of fathers, Paul VI felt obliged to restate the monarchical role of the Pope, that the Pope is in charge, or the Pope is the ruler. It seems to give consolation to these fathers who just couldn't cope with this change, any sense in which the Pope is not, I don't know. You need to do an independent study of it, which I haven't done, to see exactly what it says. Okay. Well, on 21st of November, Lumen Gentium, the dogmatic constitution on the church, was promulgated, was passed by the council. But obviously this note is going to linger around. This note will have questioned the relationship with the Pope, even personal relations, what's going on. So the issue of collegiality is still around. It's not been solved. But then Paul is wonderful for doing symbolic things. So forget about the note. I'm going to India, folks. He's going to India. So he made a pilgrimage to India at the beginning of December 1964 for the 38th Eucharistic Congress in Mumbai. Now, this is an amazing action. We've seen him go to Holy Land. Now he's gone to India, which, of course, is an outreach to the people of India, but for people of so many different faiths. So he's kind of giving his backing to Nostra Aetate, but in a practical way, showing profound respect for the people of India and acting out the attitude which the church must have towards other faiths. Okay. So that's the end of session 3, which was 1964. This is December 64. So we've only got one session to go. And then another 5 popes to look at. Gaudium et Spes. Right. As he's already sort of indicated, and this is my comment, Paul VI is going to be much more hands-on in the final session of the council. This is unprecedented for a council to have a pope taking such a large part in its activities. But looking back on it personally, because he's such a wonderful person, I think he did a good job. It's a different situation. There's the media, there's the huge numbers. He has to work for unity with the people who don't agree. Now, the issue of Pope and bishops, he was obviously anxious about this. So when he opened the fourth session, 14th of September 1965, he announced that he was setting up a synod of bishops. A synod of bishops? Unheard of. No, not unheard of, because in the early centuries, there were often local synods, there were all kinds of different synods in which bishops particularly came together in different parts of the church. This looks like a response to the need for collegiality, for the Pope to work with the bishops. It was made clear, however, that the synod was strictly advisory. Well, you'd expect it to be strictly advisory, I would say, in its defense. But where are we going with this? Have we got, and where did it actually go? It didn't go very far, even though Pope Francis tried to sort of give it new life. But for people to say, well, what the synod says is law, what about the Pope? And I think that has come back in recent discussions about synodality, even in this country. You know, the synod cannot make the law. You think, well, why are you saying it like that? Why are you not saying that the synod, inspired by the Holy Spirit, makes a contribution to the ongoing understanding of the whole church? Yeah, I prefer to say it in a way like that. And in this opening statement, therefore, in September 65, Paul talked about the synod. He also signaled his satisfaction with this document, Gaudium et Spes. Gaudium et Spes, joy and hope, is the pastoral constitution. Remember, we've described it as a pastoral council. This is a pastoral ecumenical council. This is a pastoral constitution. The four constitutions, this is the one on the church in the modern world, which begins with the word, the joy and hope, the sorrow and anxiety of the people of our time are shared by the disciples of Christ. Okay, the first document, once they got started with work in the final session, was Dignitatis Humanae, about religious liberty, promoted particularly by an American Jesuit, Father John Courtney Murray. Got great backing from the bishops of the US because of the implications of US Constitution, which we're still hearing about. There were fathers who said, we can't have religious liberty. We can't allow people to make their own choice about religion. That was the conservative attitude. But Cardinal Josef Beran, Czech cardinal, who'd been incarcerated at Dachau and then by the communists and recently been freed, declared to the assembly that religion should not be opposed on people. So when you get huge figures like that coming and saying things, that's bound to influence the vote. Gaudium et Spes is having its problems, and which is a document which expresses the love of the church for the world and for its people. And it was above all Karl Rahner, great German Jesuit theologian, and Joseph Ratzinger, whom we know, who opposed it, along with their bishops, that it lacked theological foundations. But you can read it today. Well, is it lacking theology? I don't know. I don't think so. Okay. So we're going through the final, we've got into the final session. And we're going to have another great symbolic action from Paul VI, because on the 4th of October 1965, just coming up to 60 years ago, he went to the United Nations. He went to New York. So think, his visit to the Holy Land had made huge statements about relations with the Orthodox and potentially also with Muslims. Visit to India pushed forward esteem for other faiths. And now he goes to this world body, the UN, which was celebrating 20 years, just as now it's celebrating how many? How many years ago? That was 65. So it's celebrating 80 years this year, the UN, and has got a momentous week coming up as we speak. So Paul gave a speech in which, if you read between the lines, there were allusions to Gaudium et Spes, the church for the world, and Dignitatis Humanae, religious liberty. And then he culminates, it's given in French, and he culminates with this cry of jamais plus la guerre, jamais, war never again. You can still see him if I do that. Jamais plus la guerre, jamais plus la guerre, never more war, which is just. Now, John XXIII's final encyclical was Pacem in Terris, peace on earth. So this is being carried forward and becomes, obviously it was for the earlier popes of the 20th century with the First and Second World War, but this becomes now a constant concern of popes to speak out against war and to speak in favor of peace, as we see up to the present day. Cardinal Ottaviani in the council asserted agreement. All war must be outlawed. But as I said earlier, there were some of the fathers who said, no, we have a doctrine of just war, which we cannot question. Okay, and the day, and there's a very dramatic account I read somewhere of when Paul VI got off his plane coming back from New York in late morning and came straight to St. Peter's Basilica and got out of the limousine and walked up the aisle of St. Peter's to address the bishops straight after coming from New York. I mean, it's so dramatic. I don't know whether there's any film of that, but certainly it's said, he walked briskly up St. Peter's Basilica, briskly. You can see with the way he does walk very fast, as if he's got a big job to do, which is true. So it was a fantastic, the drama of so many of these things is really quite astounding. Meanwhile, on Nostra Aetate, there were these complaints from Arab countries that an approval or developing good relations with the Jews meant the recognition of Israel, because Israel had not been recognized for good reason by the Vatican as yet, that this document was pro-Israel. But there was a lot of diplomacy going on. They produced an Arabic translation of Nostra Aetate, which was shared, circulated. And of course, the section on Islam, which is not long, but which comes before Judaism, was also very important. And also Paul's visit to the United Nations. It's showing this sort of openness to all cultures and to all religions. Okay, so we're only in October. We've got 2 months to go to the end of the council. Meanwhile, I've spoken to you about Dei Verbum, which is the document on divine revelation. And here it is again. This is one of the areas where, for me as scripture person, it's fascinating what's going on in their various statements about scripture. And whereas in the draft that was put forward, you can see this very conservative attitude which has not been explored, which has not listened to Protestant scholarship, etc. Once we get to the final session, and this has been worked on, has become De Verbum, which means the Word of God, we're getting somewhere. The compromise expressions about scripture and tradition, words about what is truth in the Bible. You no longer say absolutely everything in the Bible is true. That needs to be unpacked. So what is biblical truth? Also words about the nature of the gospel stories. Okay, so finally, De Verbum is approved. November the 18th will be a day for a party, 60 years of De Verbum, put that in your diaries. 2,344 in favour, bishops. How many against? Six. Six against. So does the church agree with this? Yes, kind of, 2,344. So the council then moves towards its conclusion, as I said earlier, with the lifting of excommunication between Orthodox and Catholics. And on the 8th of December, Immaculate Conception, 1965, Mass in St. Peter's Square, 300,000 people in attendance, and that's the council. Except that's just the start. Implementation of so many decisions of Vatican II is going to proceed with various kinds of success, etc. In the remaining years of Paul VI, who died in 1978. So Paul had another 13 years leading the implementation of Vatican II. The issue which is hanging around to this day, collegiality. How does Pope relate to bishops? So the principal two popes of Vatican II are John XXIII and Paul VI. I mean, you might argue that some of the popes before John XXIII were preparing the way in ways that we didn't appreciate. Pius XII, Pius X, even Leo XIII. Okay, so now, having come to the death of Paul VI in 1978, what are we doing? We're going to see how the council was taken forward by subsequent popes. John Paul I, John Paul II, Benedict, Francis, Leo. Obviously, I'm not going into great detail, particularly on Pope Leo, for obvious reasons. The successor of Paul VI was Albino Luciani, and he had been Italian, obviously. He had been Bishop of Vittorio Veneto during the council and had attended the council. And I saw a note somewhere about how he was so anxious to hear from the experts. He wanted to know what they were saying so that the council could do its work properly. So it's very humble. I'm a bishop, but I don't know. I have to listen to people. So that was a very significant attitude of many bishops. We want to learn because we need to take the church forward. He became Patriarch of Venice, just like John XXIII, but as we know, he lived only 33 days as Pope. But maybe the most meaningful thing is that he called himself John Paul, John XXIII and Paul VI. So he's brought together those two popes, the two popes of the council, in his name. And I think that was a signal that we all understood. John Paul I is saying, this is about taking forward the legacy, the council, which has been led by John and Paul. And then we had another conclave. This was the year of the three popes, 1978, which brought about a huge surprise, the massive change of the first non-Italian pope, for hundreds of years, Karol Wojtyła, who had attended the council as Archbishop of Krakow. This brought change. This man of immense talent and experience, but also his sense of church. And this is obviously going to happen. You've had Italian popes, no problem. When you get someone from somewhere else with their own tradition of church, they're going to bring that into the mix, if you like, just as Francis brought Latin America into the mix. Now, when Karol Wojtyła becomes Pope, we have to mention that Joseph Ratzinger, Father Joseph Ratzinger, the assistant to Cardinal Frings at the council, had been made Archbishop of Munich the previous year by Paul VI. And in 1981, the new Pope, John Paul II, brings him to Rome as prefect of the Holy Office, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. In other words, a successor of Ottaviani, not the immediate successor, there'd been a couple in between, but he was now in a very powerful position as the leader of the Holy Office. And in a way, Karol Wojtyła and Joseph Ratzinger were a sort of double act for many years. I'm not sure how accurate it is to say that, but you get that feeling in the sense that they both lasted for a long time in their office. One of the things to mention, obviously, the papacy of John Paul was very long. We can't possibly explore it from the point of view of Vatican II, but there's one or two things to say that I would like to say. In 1985, 40 years ago, 20 years after the council, actually when that book on the Vatican II by those who were there, that book came out 20 years after the council, there was, called by John Paul II, an extraordinary synod. So synods, set up by Paul VI, had been in operation every 3 years, I think. There was an extraordinary synod. So when they had something which was not in the normal progress of events, they called it an extraordinary synod. And this was an extraordinary synod to mark 20 years since the end of the council, looking at how things were shaping up. It wasn't all positive. For example, the idea of the church as people of God, in which every person was equally important, was kind of not really accentuated. And the question of episcopal collegiality was not really on the agenda. So things which get neglected and begin to wither. Now, Cardinal Ratzinger expressed his views about the council 20 years on in a series of interviews published in 1985, which became known, I don't think he called them this, as the Ratzinger Report. The Ratzinger Report. And I think one of the threads of this was that the church had suffered immense damage since the council. And I've just got this phrase which I picked up from John Allen's biography of Pope Benedict, which talks about latent, polemical, and centrifugal forces. So there are people who are challenging the church in different ways, and centrifugal forces, they're not happy with the Pope at the center. They want to go to the peripheries. Well, that sounds familiar. But how do peripheries relate to the center? It's related to collegiality and synodality. So that's an event of some importance. And obviously the Ratzinger story is going to continue with him as Benedict, and there's huge amount to say as there is about John Paul II. And the fact that I'm not giving them much time is by no means a judgment. It's just trying to get it all in appropriately in the story of 7 popes. John Paul, meanwhile, continued what Paul VI had started, which is traveling to the world, and obviously enhanced the thing no end with his travels all over. Also in 1986, I think this relates strongly to the council, he called together an interreligious meeting in Assisi in Italy, which was controversial. They couldn't say it was praying together because there were people who said we can't pray together because we have different gods. Of course, that's all to be debated. But to be together and pray for peace, that was the slogan. We're coming together to pray for peace. So representatives from all kinds of religion, not just Muslims and Hindus and Jews, but I don't know how many religions were represented. And this was opposed. This was not thought to be a good idea. I'm not sure where the opposition came from, possibly from the Holy Office, but I'm not sure of that. But John Paul went ahead and did it anyway. And he had another meeting, similar meeting in 1999, in preparation for the millennium. So this is obviously a statement that Nostra Aetate is a good thing. The outreach of Vatican II to other faiths is a good thing. And this has to be part of the reality of the church. When the millennium came, in his document Novo Millennio Ineunte, the beginning of the new millennium, 2001, John Paul spoke about the Petrine ministry, and he was very clear in an earlier encyclical, Ut Unum Sint, on ecumenism, about wanting non-Catholic colleagues to advise, to suggest about the role of the Petrine ministry. So what is the role of the Pope, even in a wider Christendom? And also he spoke about episcopal collegiality, and he insisted that these issues must constantly be examined to ensure that they are following a genuinely evangelical inspiration. Now you may say, oh, it's fine words, but it is about, these are issues for the church which are not going away. And even just to mention them, they haven't gone away, you know, is good for the church. But it's going to be left really for some time until, well, they're going to be properly solved. After 27, I'm sorry that I've got a bit behind with the slides. So you've had, there's Albino Luciani, there's Karol Wojtyła, and here's Benedict. So after 27 years of the papacy of John Paul, he died in April 2005, and the cardinals chose Joseph Ratzinger as the next pope. Famous speech to the Curia that year in December, he insisted that the council was marked by continuity with the past and by reform, but not by rupture. Now, there's a whole debate about how pre-Vatican II and post-Vatican II relate to each other, and there's obviously all kinds of people getting in on that debate who've got very clear ideas which might not correspond to what the council was really about. So Benedict was kind of rather defensive. It's about continuity and reform. And then in the year of faith, which he declared beginning in 2012, which of course is 50 years since the beginning of the council, he gave a thorough endorsement of the council and described its documents as a compass guiding the ship of the church. compass guiding the ship of the church. Now, Benedict obviously had a huge culture, huge Bavarian culture, and an immense erudition as a theologian. So it's extremely sensitive to how the church would be going forward. One of the most remarkable things for me is his announcement in 2007 with the document Summorum Pontificum that there could be unrestricted celebration of the Tridentine Rite Mass. In other words, of the Mass of 62, the Mass before the Council. That these two Masses, priests could choose which one they celebrate, which I know many in the church will have felt, no, this can't be the way to go. But I think we have to understand it. Again, as with Paul VI, and I didn't say anything about Archbishop Lefebvre and the Mass and all the controversies during Paul VI and John Paul II. But I think we've got to understand it as being, this is a forlorn attempt to solve this issue of the Tridentine Mass and the new Mass, the Vatican II Mass. Okay. And as we know, Benedict resigned in 2003 and lived on in the Vatican, in the monastery, until he died 2 or 3 years ago. So finally, we get to Pope number 6. He's not number 7 yet. This is number 6. So elected in 2013, Jorge Mario Bergoglio made clear that Vatican II is my greatest teacher. Okay. Austin Ivory, his great biography, The Great Reformer, and then Wounded Shepherd, writes some wonderful things about Francis and from an insider's perspective. So Francis comes from Argentina, so he comes with the whole tradition of Latin American Episcopal conferences. Now, the Episcopal Conference, about which I've said nothing, is one of the creations of Vatican II, so that bishops come together in their own countries and work together. And this was taken on board very quickly in the whole of Latin America. And they created this thing called CELAM, C-E-L-A-M, which is Episcopal Conference of Latin America, and had their first meeting in 1968, so very soon after the council ended, in Medellin in Venezuela, I think, endorsing Vatican II. And then going forward a few years, 2007, they had a meeting in Aparecida in Brazil, at which the bishops spelt out a new way of being church, basically. And this was largely influenced by Jorge Mario Bergoglio. Did he write it? Or he was certainly in the writing team and he was leading the writing. So this is about bringing Vatican II into the present. Published in 2013 and used by Pope Francis. We think, well, how is it Pope Francis hit the ground running? Oh, that's a fascinating story, but he did. He got on with stuff immediately. And his document, Evangelii Gaudium, Joy of the Gospel, is really a presentation of the insights of Aparecida, of CELAM, of the Latin American Bishops' Conference. So we're getting, they went forward, but they're also part of the church. Oh, we're going to bring that with us because you've elected me as Pope. And I think it's reliably said, I can't remember if it's one of Austin Ivory's books, that it was on his insistence that he didn't become Pope in 2005. He wasn't ready. So when it came to 2013, he must have realized that, well, who knows what's going to happen. But he was ready, I think, psychologically, spiritually, mentally. And that's why we have a Pope getting things going. And in relation to Vatican II, he knew what he was doing. Okay. So Pope Francis offers the Universal Church the riches of Salem, of the Aparecida document, and the collegial work of the churches of Latin America and their response to Vatican II has fed the Universal Church. In his papacy of 12 years, Francis always consulted. He set up immediately a special council of 8 cardinals from across the world who met regularly to advise him. Now, I go to Rome once a year for a meeting of the Biblical Commission, and we meet in the Casa Santa Marta, where the Pope is and the cardinals are. And I'm thinking, oh, those cardinals are here again. And there they were from all over, meeting with the Pope, and the Pope listening to them, just like John XXIII said, I want to listen to what people are saying. Also, he reinvigorated the Synod of Bishops, particularly when it came, you remember when we had the Synod on the family, and all of a sudden our parishes were being consulted about different questions in relation to the family. And many parishes didn't get their act together because they weren't quite sure what was going on. And of course, as always, there's a very sort of limited time frame. But this was from Francis. It was like, we need to listen to the bishops. We need to listen to the people. And that's how this idea of this practice of walking together, of synodality, was being brought into the church, which is now taking off. I think for those of us reflecting on the papacy of Pope Francis, Evangelii Gaudium, that first document, is hugely important. When it comes to how he built on the teaching of Vatican II, I kind of see it as very much because he's into what the world wants of us, what we can offer to help the world. I would say that the 2 encyclicals, Laudato Si in 2015 and Fratelli Tutti in 2020, these are the ones which, these are documents for us now. And there are other things of importance too, of course. So he developed the social teaching of the church in 2015 with Laudato Si, Praise Be, words of St. Francis of Assisi. And this is about care for our common home. And that's obviously driven by the climate crisis and the fact that, this is a new area of papal teaching, if you like. I mean, there are links. There are things that earlier popes said about war and the exploitation of the environment, the exploitation of people, etc. But this is a huge contribution which has had a massive impact throughout the world in people doing things about climate, doing things about the environment. Don't take your impression just from what we might be doing in this country and what America might be doing. Over the world and throughout the church, this is very a huge development. This initiative, again, thinking back to Athenagoras, this was driven forward with the ecumenical patriarch Bartholomew, Patriarch of Constantinople, leader of the Orthodox Christians, who had long been involved in such work. So it was almost Bartholomew saying, "Here, come on, Francis, we need to do this together." But the fact that we're doing it together is of extraordinary significance. And in that encyclical, Laudato Si, look at the footnotes. He's listening to bishops' conferences. So these groups of bishops from different countries. I just flicked through. Philippines, Germany, Dominica, Japan, Brazil, Portugal, Mexico. So the experience and the wisdom, the inspiration of all these church groups, who probably themselves were listening to their own people, all of this is coming into his Laudato Si. Then the second one, second hugely important encyclical is Fratelli Tutti, brothers and sisters all, and developing new ways of outreach to the world, building on Gaudium et Spes. I've got here paragraphs 1 and 24. They've got some kind of link there. This encyclical is subtitled On Fraternity and Social Friendship. So just when it's needed, just when the world is falling apart, but not well known enough, we've got a document saying we are brothers and sisters. And this is not just silly talk. This is the reality that we must live. And the church is part of this and trying to promote this, along with so many others. So we have an extraordinary event. February 2019, Pope Francis went to Abu Dhabi and signed the document on human fraternity for world peace and living together. And he signed it with the Grand Imam Ahmad Al-Tayeb of Al-Azhar University in Cairo, so one of the greatest Muslim scholars. And they are signing this document and inviting people to work for world peace. And of course, you can say, well, you go back to Pacem in Terris of John XXIII, 1963, to Pope Paul VI, Jamais plus la guerre in the United Nations. And now we have this huge commitment to working for peace that is part of the work of the Catholic Church. I just want to add, because I mentioned Summorum Pontificum, the document by Benedict, allowing the celebration of both of the forms of the rite of Mass. In 2021, Francis issued Traditionis Custodes, protectors of tradition, which reimposed limits on the celebration of the pre-Vatican II Mass. They had a survey, and it was clear that this permission to celebrate the old Mass was being abused as a demonstration of opposition to the Council. And Pope Francis, if you oppose the Council, you're no longer Catholic. This is pretty serious stuff, because it's not opposing the Pope, it's opposing the Church in Council, which made certain statements. And also, Pope Francis, if you're into questions of liturgical translation, he issued a document in 2017, which is trying to redress the very sort of rigid translation policy which came in 2001 and which has had an effect on the translations of the liturgy which we've had ever since. So he's made it clear that it is up to the bishops' conferences to look at these things, and they make the decisions, which are then, I think, probably rubber stamped by Rome, but who knows? Liturgy is going to be, well, it's continuing to be extremely contentious. Pope Francis' final years were marked by insistence on the creation of a synodal church. So the insight of Vatican II, Lumen Gentium, that all members of the people of God have a role in the church, was going to be implemented more fully. And we can see this, for example, in the formal institution by the bishop of lay catechists, of readers, of ministers of the Eucharist. All these things are out there now. Francis has given them to the church. It's the local bishops' conferences which need to implement them. But this is all part of Lumen Gentium, is acknowledging the place and the importance of everyone in the church, and the synods on synodality. Hopefully that is a process which is gradually being sorted out in each country so that we can have the fruits of it. Because quite likely a lot of priests and bishops are saying, oh, I've got enough to do, or I'm not quite sure what to do about this. But it's from Lumen Gentium. This is Vatican II stuff that Pope Francis was convinced we need to offer this to the church, and he managed to do that. Going back to Richard, coming to the end, going back to Richard Gayadets. And if you want to spell his name, there it is. Richard Gayadets, I told you, died young of cancer, but was a huge huge expert on Vatican II. He wrote his final book, An Unfinished Council.
What?
Vatican II, Pope Francis, and the Renewal of Catholicism. This is a wonderful book to read. And he said, no post-conciliar pope can match Pope Francis' comprehensive and integrated retrieval of the Council's deeper reformist impulse. So his comprehensive and integrated retrieval of the Council's deeper reformist impulse. You can meditate on that for weeks. And then he says, indeed, Francis' audacious confidence in the work of the Spirit to renew the Church recalls the equally audacious vision of Pope St. John XXIII. So, wonderful, wonderful scholar. Such a shame that he's died so young. So that came out in 2015, published by someone, I think in the States. Yeah, Liturgical Press, but easy to get hold of on the internet. Pope Francis was Pope number 6, Pope number 7. 2 days after his election, Pope Leo addressed the following words to the College of Cardinals. I would like to renew together today our complete commitment to the path that the Universal Church has now followed for decades in the wake of the Second Vatican Council. Pope Francis masterfully and concretely set it forth in his apostolic exhortation, Evangelii Gaudium. So we are confidently awaiting that the Holy Spirit, which has guided the Church, will guide the Church now in this new time with this new Pope, and that we will continue, and perhaps with more vigor, being able to receive from Vatican II and from its teaching so much which will help the Church and indeed help the world. Thank you very much.